maybe we'll start talking and people can join us. I thought I'd open our call today remembering those opening sessions that we had back. I know there were two different ones because of time zones, so I'm not sure if we were all in the same one. And I don't even remember, it was so long ago. And there was a question that we discussed in our small groups that was, when does bridging expertise create new possibilities for change? And so now here we are about a month later talking about the role of translators. And so I thought I'd just sort of open by asking how you might think about that question now after having been in Convergence for a month. Don't all talk at once.
I had to be honest, I had a hard time with that question. It was like the very first one you guys asked, and I was kind of like silent, as we are now, because I was like, when would it not be good, you know, to be crossing sectors? Like, when could you not solve a problem that way? It just seems like the only way to solve a complicated problem is with a multi-sector approach and with a diverse way of thinking around it. So that's why I had a little bit of a hard time, and I still do with it.
Do you think you would answer it the same way now, Sarah, after having gone through a month?
Yes, I would answer it more the same way. Like, definitely, that's what we've been doing. And, you know, it's been really interesting. I'm like more on the, you know, direct service GBV side. It's, you know, don't often get to interact with the finance side. So it's just a whole different set of conversations than you normally have when you're just with your direct service group.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo that. I was not in the first, I just saw the recorded version because I was on holidays. But when I think, I'm a practitioner on gender-based violence, when I think only about prevention of gender violence, if I'm talking about civil society and grassroots, even when talking without finance in the picture, we need to have cross-sector. So, and that's one of the issues in prevention of violence, of not having the educational sector, the health sector, the transport sector, urban planning sector. So that if we're not all working together, it's going to be very difficult to be able to end violence against women. So even without talking to the finance sector, we already need a cross sector. But yeah, definitely. And I think for me, it's been an amazing learning curve, the Convergence, because I am not so familiar with how the finance sector can collaborate. And as I said in a previous session today, I mean, for me, one of the amazing things to see how many different entry points were kind of identified. So yeah, I think definitely bridging expertise is critical.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I mean, that I thought it was important before, I still do, and how I think I thought about it differently now is just more of the tangible examples and also some of the really beautiful ways that can bring things to life. And I think, I mean, really, it might seem simple, but I think it's really powerful. Even the way we've been starting a lot of these sessions, really just focusing on the fact that we're bringing these abstract conversations to something that is deeply human. I think, you know, in the past I've been quite focused around how do we, my background's in finance, I work in gender equality. I've been new to like really understanding the complexities of, you know, domestic and family violence and so forth. And for me, I'm like, how do I help my colleagues know more about finance? Because I find that really fascinating and enlightening and an opportunity to use power to drive change. I think vice versa, though, again, there's so much opportunity to bring not just impact, but like a deep human joy also into the finance sector from having this cross-sectional communication. I mean, it's such a pleasure to even just join this conference and we talk about finance and having this deeply human connection. So I think that would have ripple effects for the whole sector, which would be amazing. So I think it has just brought it to life in new ways.
Thank you. I really appreciate that importance of human connection. I don't think we call it out as much as we should.
I would echo what Sarah sort of started with of when is it not? For me, my answer to this question at the start of Convergence was, in fact, isn't that the only time that possibilities for new change can occur? And I think I believe that and have thought about that very theoretically, almost like a belief system of this is how we get to change. But being in these conversations over the last few weeks, similar to what Rosanna and Laura have mentioned, there's some such tangible examples and entry points that I wouldn't have even imagined. And, you know, Anna and I work in this every day and we can't always see the possibilities. So I think that's been such a value of having all of these minds come together.
I would add that for me, as someone who's in the trenches, dealing daily with, you know, people who are struggling and coming out of, you know, violent situations, just being in a group of people who bring a positive energy that there can be change and there should be change and that we can connect for change, helps keep perspective, because there are definitely times where as service providers, we just lose all hope of it ever getting better. You know, I have those days where I remember saying to my dad, I feel like I'm trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. And that, you know, here we're connecting with people who can actually see the system from hovering above on some level and saying, well, you know, if we could change that, we could change this too. And just bringing that freshness and hope, because absolutely this should be a solvable problem. That energy is just so important for us, for people in the trenches.
I will add, I come from the university system and I sort of consider myself a recovering academic, right? And I sought out Criterion partly because I was frustrated with the narrowing of expertise in the university system. And I just so value what Criterion does in bringing people together across expertise for social change. I think that's what we've done here at this conference. That's why I wanted us to sort of think through from the very beginning, because I think this translator role is what we've been working on really this whole month. And so I'm just thrilled to be here with all of you. This seems like a great group. So yay, thank you. And before we go too much farther, I thought we'd take a moment to do our acknowledgements. So asking that everyone lift your hands up off the keyboard for just a moment and really be grounded here where we are. And so please take hold of your own hand and remember that we are not alone and that we have power in our hands, and that this is not a light topic, and that in this conversation we will intellectualize and abstract very real experiences, and that these discussions may trigger a wide range of emotions, and that in this room, statistically, are many survivors of gender-based violence, and that all of us participate in political, social, cultural, and economic systems that give permission for and that facilitate violence. And so taking just a moment of silence to acknowledge the violence that's happening in this precise moment. And now please reverse your hands and notice the difference. And here we are together, coming together to create new possibilities to address the epidemic of violence in our world. and we get to be connected in new ways. And as we were just discussing, that means that we can do even more. So now we'll jump in. Thank you. Thank you all. So just some framing as we dive into our conversation. So I have seen through different sessions, and I know this role of translators and translation has come up a lot. For the purpose of today, we're talking about translators as individual people playing a role. So organizations obviously play a role as translators, but it's the individuals who are inside the organizations who are doing that work. So really grounding our conversation, thinking about that individual perspective. And also here we are in our final week in the implementation section of Convergence. And so really grounding in implementation. What does this look like? How do we enact and make this happen? So for this, I see sort of three themes that I thought we could address. And the first one is, how do we find them? How do we look for these translators? What are the qualities that are essential? What are the skills that can be learned versus what can't be taught? The second is how we address the power imbalances, because there are perceptions about different value of gender or gender-based violence expertise versus finance expertise, and really trying to dismantle that and address that straight on, that power imbalance in this translator role. And then finally, how do we position gender-based violence and gender-based violence and finance translators to be the best positioned and best supported for success? So whose role is it to support them? What is the responsibility of different fields, of the finance field, the direct service field, the field of working in women's economic empowerment? And then really, if we can get there to that gritty sort of, what's the business model? How do we pay for it and make it happen? So that's where I thought we'd go. And I also learned that through Convergence, you can have a path and we might just go where we go. So we'll also just leave it open. But that's one avenue that we might go down. But potentially starting with this idea about who are these translators? Where do we find them? How do we look for them? What are these qualities that are essential? And maybe opening it with some example scenarios that you have encountered, or just thoughts on sort of what are these qualities that we need to be looking for in these individuals.
So, I'm going to just jump in here. One thing I've done as an investor is I've started putting my line down in the sand. What are you doing in your company, in your organization, to prevent gender-based violence? And if you're not doing anything, are you willing to learn? And I have pulled investments, and I have also not invested in, things that have been pitched to me just because there's no willingness to learn and shift and change and be part of the solution. And I wouldn't accept that for climate change. Why should I accept that for this? So just having that line in the sand that I set down, you want to pitch an idea to me, you want to pitch a company to me, that's fine. Does it have a plan for ending gender-based violence? And being part of the conversation. I think if we start the conversation, people are going to go, oh, what does that mean? And then we can have the conversation on how to fix that.
Yeah, I mean, walking the talk is critical, right? So otherwise, but I'm just thinking basically about the role of a translator. First of all, it has to be people who speak both languages, right? So that's kind of the basic thing they need to, and also the willingness to understand the other side, which I think that's a lot of what we're doing here. And probably we need to, And maybe this could be the beginning of identifying the translators. So people from the both sectors that want to learn each other's languages. Because I think people who are here already interested in working together. So the interest is already there and are willing to learn from the other sector. So this could be a beginning, like from that networks that's being created here, who are the people who are willing to really go deeper in the language of the other sector. So I think for me that would be a very good beginning, because it's a group of people already very interested in both sectors. And I can say personally, I would be super interested in learning more the other language to be able to do that. And I think for me, again, thinking about the translator is the language, but is the context as well. Like I have friends who are translators and they speak both languages, but you need, when you're doing like a conference, you need to study. Like, so whenever you need to talk about specifics, you need to go deep dive. So I think it's an ongoing process of learning, right? So yeah, these are my initial thoughts.
I think it's also, I like that description, Laura, and I think it's not only speaking each other's language, because it is a language, but it's also understanding what is convincing to people in the other field and what information and knowledge you have to provide. So what context, do you need to bring from the field that you're in, but also understanding how to be selective about that and bring the pieces that are going to be most convincing and prioritize those, just understanding what the motivations are going to be.
Yeah, I was just also reflecting on what a translator does, and it can often be between two people, but it can also be to take a conversation between two people and really bring that into something that a number of people can understand. And so again, the qualities of someone, I mean, if we're looking for the be all and end all, like someone as well that can drive something beyond the conversation that might be happening between two people and translate it into ways that multiple people can also understand. So I don't know, it's kind of what everyone's been saying, but I think I liked the distinction between being bilingual and being a translator that was raised during the conference, and really digging a bit deeper on that.
Yeah, I really appreciate that point you just made, Rosanna, because I feel like it's almost like in the GBV finance world. And also, hello everyone, so sorry for being super late to this call. I think I know most of you, but I'll drop a little intro in there so you kind of know who I am, what I'm up to as well. I think in the GBV finance world, I've found kind of there's two types of translators. So one is just, it's actually people who belong, who have a home in one of these worlds, but have intentionally ventured out to be guests in the other. So they're like welcome, trusted guests. They like get it, like they understand, to Jennifer's point, like how to influence, like what to elevate, etc. But like they're from one place. Like I kind of consider myself like I'm like a gender person. Like that's who I am. I'm a feminist. I also happen to be trained in how to speak to people from the finance world. I think finance is very important. So like I can hold my own in the conversation, but like where I rest my head at night, right, is like a bit the gender side. I think that is helpful for folks. That's helpful for kind of making things happen, because fundamentally you need to have a home to actually like make something happen and get like a large group of stakeholders who like don't care at all about the other thing to like move, right? But then there's like these brokers, almost like people who bring conveners, people who like bring the two worlds together, make the introductions, and then step back. And that's like a much more like in many sense, like Criterion is doing this with this conference, right? Like, but that's like a much more, you need to know the signals you need to give both sides to show that you are in fact understanding and empathize. It's more diplomatic. It's more like a negotiation, because it's like a brokering of this like delicate relationship, versus I think perhaps like what I do, just like I'm like, okay, how do we get more money to women? So I'm going to go out and like find the people who know money and know how to speak that way. So it's like, it's a little bit just, I think there's brokers and there's like welcome guests or like tourists, voyagers, whatever we want to call them.
That also makes me think of another trait that I think is really important in this kind of brokering or interpreting or translating role, and it's patience. Because if you're on, I mean, these are two worlds that are pretty distinct and don't necessarily overlap very often. And I think that there has to be patience to build the bridges and identify the allies and give people time to kind of understand what they can do to create change and how they can kind of come partway across the bridge. And so I think the diplomacy piece is really important, and understanding how far somebody's come in this discussion and what you need to do to bring them a little bit further. So there's a lot of skills involved.
Yeah, I really like Shruti's comment about being a broker, because it's more than translating, because it's understanding each other's, like both sides' agendas, and trying to help them to find the common ground. So what's what's the win-win situation? So it's more than just, I think putting together what Jennifer said about understanding what are the levers, what is there for the other side. So a good broker would probably be able to identify that and help both sides to identify that. They might not be seeing that, and the translator would need to help each side to understand what's in for them there if they can't see.
Yeah, I appreciate that as well. We were talking internally a couple of weeks ago about this translator concept and sort of debating if in traditional translation, a translator's job is just to be as most accurate in relaying information right from one language to another. And the way we're positioning it, and perhaps broker is maybe even a better word, was that this was someone who was doing that language and culture context translation that someone else also brought up, which is sort of as important as the language, but they were doing it with an intention, with a goal to do something with it, to push an agenda in a certain way, which is different than how sort of traditional language translators are usually employed.
That makes me think of another part of that conversation we had as a team, Ariana, that might be worth sharing, which was about sort of fluency and this idea that if you're a translator, at the UN General Assembly, you have to be fluent in both languages that you're translating between flawlessly. And that indeed in this area, or even if you're sort of a regular person on holidays in a country where you speak a little bit of the language and the person you're with doesn't speak any, that you don't actually have to know it all to step into that translation role, that you don't have to be an expert. We often talk about expertise and how sometimes the sense of needing to be an expert can hold us back from taking action. And I think about this translation piece as not necessarily feeling like you have to be fluent in finance and GBV to possibly, both of them equally, to possibly be able to translate, that you can step into that with what you have.
Yes. And I would say my kind of provocation, so please disagree, right? It's like, I think you don't have to be fluent in both to be a voyager. So you can say and I'm just making out naming ourselves and putting us in groups, which historically has never ended well. But this idea that I'm a GBV expert. I really want to kind of have more intersection with finance. I really need to be really fluent in GBV. I need to have working proficiency of finance, right? But that broker role that we talked about, that's where you really do need the fluency, because that's not just talking to people at the intersection. That's talking to people who are just not in the other world at all. And so that's why you need a lot more fluency there. But if you're just a voyager, you can kind of get by with just working proficiency in one.
I guess
I would agree with that totally, especially because one person that understands gender-based violence fully doesn't necessarily have to understand all the words and language of finance, right? It's maybe enough to be working proficiency. So I would totally agree with that. And I think that's even more important, that you truly like have a mother tongue, like one field where you are completely fluent, and then the other one you have working knowledge, because that also means that you're open to learning from the other side, right? And it still means that you come with an intention, and likely that intention also stems from that field that you know best, right? It comes from like either the finance side. So if you are a finance person looking to learn from the GBV people, you still have your financial objectives at mind, right? And if you are a gender-based violence practitioner, like you know everything about that topic, you are curious to learn about finance because you don't speak that language fluently yet. So I actually think it can be an advantage if you know one field better than the other, and you can maybe also be a better broker in that sense. And sorry, Judith, to cut you off.
No worries. I think what is not quite sitting with me is the idea of translator rather than facilitator, because I think that, first of all, it isn't binary. It isn't GBV side and finance side, because on the finance side, there's finance investments, finance philanthropy, finance, like there are other ways we look at finance, within the finance community, different points that have to be kept in the conversation to make it a true, when we talk about blended finances, how do we deal with, different pieces to put together a puzzle? Same thing on the GBV side. So, there are GBV, people who are rescue and rehabilitate. There are GBV who's prevention. There's GBV who's, educate children to grow up being, understanding equality. So the person who is facilitating a conversation is really someone who I think needs to have enough knowledge in a couple pieces of the pie to at least be able to facilitate a conversation about what am I not understanding about what you have to offer? What are you not understanding about what your needs are? And making that happen. So rather than I don't think a direct translator, it just, for me, it doesn't work thinking about it that way. It's too complex for just translating,
I kind of with you. Yeah, I think I'm with you, Judith. And also I think we should shift a little bit to, we talk about power imbalance, because I think that brings that up too. So from the GBV direct service world, I don't feel like I have a lot of power in finance, and we've tried and we've gone there, try to engage with people who have more decision-making ability. But yeah, does a translator can they work out the power imbalance? I think, I don't know, we could agree power imbalance is probably in the financial sector rather than the gender-based violence sector. Would you agree, or what are we doing about that?
Thank you, Christy. Let's go there. I love it. I think, we see that even in how Criterion shows up, and we are paid differently if we're showing up as the finance person versus the gender person, right? So there's some monetary value placed on expertise and positioning. Curious how other people see the power imbalance between gender expertise and specifically gender-based violence and finance in this translator space.
Yeah, it's clearly a huge issue. I think I actually think that translators are, to Judith's point, facilitators, which is probably more accurate, right? Like basically the people who are doing the brokering have a huge opportunity to both like set what the power imbalance expectation, because as a lot of the times you're introducing people to each other who do not know each other, right? And like a lot of finance people I've talked to about gender, like they've just kind of never thought about it before. And frankly, even vice versa, gender. So it's kind of an interesting, like you kind of have the opportunity to set the narrative up front. I think so my kind of highest level answer is, I think translators not just have an opportunity, they have a duty to like really design for mitigating the power imbalance and to be power transformative. And I also think that there are practices that kind of one can put in place. And as a translator, in some sense myself, like I like reverse engineer, like who spends more, like who I bake the idea with before I bring it to home, right? Because it's like, well, the reality is, frankly, if you're running a GBV direct services organization, like you have a million things to do, you probably don't have enough money. And what you probably just need more is like time and money to like do your work, right? As opposed to kind of a lot of discussion, right, about X or Y. Because this is my personal perspective, right? So like, I think if there's kind of an initial idea or like brainstorming, etc., like I know Criterion's so thoughtful about this too, like whose time you bring in when is one way in which I think translators can kind of really lean into the power dynamic and use it to our advantage. But also just, I think, just naming it and being like really clear and often demystifying what some of the most powerful like players at the table might want, and just not trying to fully overturn, because you can't overturn like centuries of power dynamics, right, in your like 1 minute or 1 week or 1 month of translating. But I think there's something about just like doing what you can in your power, and then just being really candid and realistic about what's not in your power.
I was just thinking about something which is, I think, it's part of the problem of the system, right? And not just thinking about transactional relationships, but in a way, the way we could see that is GVB needs more finance and finance need GVB, and we need to change that, right? I think if finance or any other sector don't understand the problems that GBV create to society and them, and it's going to be generations, I think. But I think for me, that's what's the biggest issue of power imbalance, is like the perception of who needs more who, right? And I think even for us who work in the GBV sector, there is this perception that we need more them than they need us. So we need to all the time, we need to build a business case. We need to convince them that we are important, right? Which is exhausting because it's obvious why it's important, right? But not for everyone. So I think for me also to address the power imbalance, the broker, translator, facilitator, whoever you want to call, needs to help also to explain that. I don't know what's the best way to position it, but I think that's, for me, it's at the center of the power imbalance is the perception of who needs who.
Laura, what would happen if we flipped the script? What would happen if I came to you and said, I have $50,000 to give you, how would you spend it?
Well,
Instead of telling me what you need, but me coming and saying, this is what I can bring to the table. Tell me what you would do with this and why it would benefit ending GBV. Would that make that easier?
It will make it easier, but then I think my question would be, okay, so what's your agenda? Like, what do you want from it? That would be my first, okay, great, wonderful. I have really how to spend that money in a way I think it's meaningful to address the problem. But okay, so what do you want? That to be, are you just giving the money and you don't, because that's not how it works, right? So that would be my immediate question. Great, yes. And what do you want?
So what you're raising is that there are serious trust issues here.
Yeah.
I mean, for sure, right? Like, I think, I think for sure. I think it's like, it's tricky. I personally find tricky when finance folks are like, well, what will this get? Like, if I invest $100,000, like versus $200,000, like what, like, and I think that is, it just, again, goes to like the different languages, right? And like, you know this better than me, but like, there's really something about like the partnership and framing it as like both sides giving value to each other, and like actually believing that, which is honestly a bit hard, both from both sides, right? Because I think I've personally been quite suspicious of large kind of investment firms wanting to do more in GBV. Like, I'm like, I don't know, what do you want to do in GBV? Like, it's like, we're going to say a bit more, like explain, then let me see the women on your team and let me see kind of the primers you've developed on this topic. Like, it just kind of, there's that. But then similarly on the gender side, I think a lot of finance professionals find that the gender sector is one of the most suspicious sectors out there. And that's because, I mean, for centuries, everyone's been out to get us. So of course we're suspicious. So there's like that, there's that too. Like there's like kind of on both sides, a lot of lack of trust.
Yeah, I agree that both sides need to understand that there's value in cooperating. I would say to Laura's point that I do agree that a lot of times the finance people don't know yet that they need the gender-based violence experts. But I think that's exactly what we have to do, right? We have to tell the finance people why they should make use of gender-based expertise, because they will have an advantage both from a risk perspective and from a return perspective. And I think that's why Criterion Institute really very, very valuable, because on the return side, I feel like in a lot of the gender lens investing space, we've already made a lot of good arguments, right? Like why it's both good business and socially also like yields a lot of benefits and so on. But on the risk side, there's very few people who can actually go out there and say like, look, these are the gender related risks. And I think in GBV especially, it's rather easy to point out the risks once you have made use of the data that's out there. So I think, and yes, it is a bit tedious to do that, right? And it shouldn't be the case that we have to educate finance people about why they need gender-based violence experts. But I think it's a very valuable task, and it will eventually lead to a change in thinking, I believe.
Thank you, Regina. And I think we've seen a turning point in some industries. So for example, the Me Too in the entertainment industry, there was a moment where sort of the industry as a whole realized their risk, right? And so and then there was a switch in that power dynamic. Mary, did you, I know you've been a little quiet. Did you have thoughts you wanted to add to this piece of the conversation?
Well, I have a lot of thoughts that I'm trying to select which might be helpful. I guess I'll say two things. One is I found the conversation about translators and brokers very interesting in my field, which I'm trained as a systematic theologian. So a little bit different than I think the majority of the participants this month. And for translating texts, like if you're looking at an ancient text, that's kind of utilitarian. So I agree with this conversation about moving away from translator. It's actually interpreters. So the Greek word hermeneutics, that you're actually invested in making the text relevant for a new group of people. So I think maybe interpreter would be another noun I would add to that pool that goes with broker. I think one of the questions that I wrote down as I was listening, which is which sector serves which? And I wondered if there's something helpful in thinking about the way some of this is framed in terms of you were talking about cost and risk, and then you were talking about ethical or moral obligation of finance. And somebody mentioned how clear it was that there is an obligation for protecting the climate. And I wonder if moving to a broader perspective about talking about the cost and risk and also the moral obligation for peace and safety, and that gender-based violence belongs within that kind of broader framework. And I wonder if people who are brokers or translators or interpreters rely on that kind of placement at all. And I agree. I think the threat of thinking about anything that has to do with gender is, it's trying to disrupt thousands of years of same old. So of course there's resistance. So I guess my question is, do any of you rely on a bigger picture of peace and safety to, I guess, do this kind of interpretation with others?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
Human
and
rights.
are there ways that like religious communities have any kind of responsibility or role in that? That's the place that I work.
Well, I think some of the impact investors and some of the faith-based foundations and so on certainly would have that at heart, right? Like if you even read their websites and their mission statements, they would talk about peace and security and the role that religion plays, right? In some cases, I think it's less obvious when you talk about like private investors, like asset managers, institutional investors, commercial banks. Like there, you easily get lost if you start a discussion about morals and moral obligation. Even I think a lot of the private investors that jump on the climate topic, they don't see it as an obligation. They just see that there is no other choice because it has become mainstream, right? So if you don't do it, you actually end up losing money. And so I think that is where the discussion gets interesting, right? Because it's those people that don't know yet that it is something they should be doing.
And I don't mean moral obligation as in kind of the popular Christian definition of what a moral is. I mean a very ancient human understanding of an obligation to creation and the other selves in the world. It's so just to qualify, put a footnote on my terminology.
No, thank you. This is really an interesting prompt. I think I would differ very slightly from other folks who have shared about kind of the business case. I found, in my experience, I found that actually starting with the just like the case, like the human rights case, and then explaining the implications of doing something along gender with the business case in mind, right? So it's not like do it, or at least that's just, I'm like, this is my approach now. If folks who want to come on board, great. If not, I will not be your translator. But there is something about like just starting with like, we think this is important, it's often overlooked, it's like really critical. And then saying that, and there are business implications of this and let's discuss, and not actually framing it as a win-win always, because I don't think it is always a win-win. I think sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't, and we can, like, depending on your appetite for risk and return, whatnot, we can discuss, right? But like kind of the entry point being this is something that is needed for like peaceful, moral, stable societies, and that's where I think your point on kind of what is the role of the religious community comes in, because there's been a lot of discussion around how the religious community perpetuates and mitigates gender-based violence, and religious leaders as like a key influencer, in some cases gatekeepers, right, to like norms around GBV and like who is even let in to have a discussion versus not, right? So that's kind of historically how I've interacted with kind of the religious component of it, has been very much on the GBV side only and not on the finance side. But I will admit that's partly because also of just my own religious like affiliation or lack thereof, and so I'm sure there's a rich literature on the other side. I'm just not aware.
And we get to the difficult place of, well, then how do we deal with the LGBT community, and how do we deal with people with disabilities who have much higher rates of violence perpetrated against them, and how do we do we only work with women or focus on women within those communities rather than the community at whole? So on some level, when we maybe walk away from the gendered piece of this, which becomes a bit triggering in certain communities and certain conversations, and look at it is that every human deserves the right to personal security and safety, and doesn't matter what gender they were born. And if we're educating them in a way that supports understanding that you have a right to personal security, and you have the right to be treated with respect, and you have the right to not have to live through perpetrations of violence, then are we educating them also not to perpetrate? So yes. So, and isn't that what we want to be doing, especially when we start bringing into the conversation, well, you're not going to change things unless you change men also, but we're not going to change men unless we change how we educate everybody, and then getting stuck in that conversation of, well, is this about gender? Is not about gender? Is it about just reducing violence? Is this a human rights issue? Is this, and yes, I've been on this treadmill before.
Mary, I really appreciate that framing of, you know, if we are approaching gender-based violence through a lens of peace and security, does that shift the power dynamics in a way that approaching it through a gender lens might not? And I think that link to climate change, and actually we were talking about that right in the beginning of this call, it's come up a lot on sort of the gender piece has been, the sort of gender and finance has been something that's been years that people have been working on and haven't made that much traction. And here comes climate change, also important, and there is a lot of movement. And so why, and sort of, are there parallels, and can we draw on them? Christy, I'm curious because you brought us here. I'd love to hear your thoughts as well on addressing these power dynamics.
What are my thoughts? So again, I work in direct services. We've talked about this on a few other calls, but we had a discussion, you know, about engaging people like in casinos or in finance, because that's the world I'm in. You know, I'm in Las Vegas. Sorry, I didn't say that. So kind of wanted to be on this call to learn a little bit more from the other side. You know, what is an effective interpretation? Because we've kind of fallen short. We've talked about this on a few calls, but there's a lot of literature out about, you know, how gender-based violence affects finance's bottom line and their workforce productivity and things that we all here know, I'm sure. And it's just somehow not ringing hard enough for it to make a significant impact in us having a seat at the table as an equal. So that's, you know, we've tried different things in my organization, and it, you know, ends up with like kind of obligatory donation and a thank you, and then we'll write you into a policy that no one reads, kind of thing. And so, yeah, I just was curious what would do it from the investors, I guess, what would do it, what, you know, from the finance world. The religious world, is it something I haven't thought about either. So that's an interesting dynamic, because we have that, you know, a lot in our communities here, especially predominantly, well, we're a diverse area, like a lot of places, but especially we find that in the African-American community here, where there's a lot of, or the Latinx community, where there's a lot of different dynamics and what's expected in your religion and in your household kind of thing. So that might be a different conversation, but I find that interesting in this conversation as well. So that's just from what we struggle with. I'd be curious if other people in my world probably experience the same thing, but it's the same thing. But the answer, yeah, I don't know. What more do people in finance care about? Obviously, how they're doing financially and that they're making a profit. And there's already like substantive research out about GDP on a large scale and just individual organizations and the statistics around how many of their employees are affected by gender-based violence. So yeah, I don't know how to interpret it between the two. So we feel like we actually are heard. One thought I had was, maybe, and every country's a little different with their healthcare system. Ours is jacked up in a lot of ways, but we've tried to engage more maybe with women's health field that see it every day, you know, in their world. And then they have obviously access to finance as well, because there's a lot going on in our healthcare system here with privately funded things. So that's one thought. I don't know if anyone's had any luck with healthcare, working with gender-based violence and the people of money in healthcare, but yeah.
Christy, to your point, when the gender-based violence data will be heard by the finance people, we had actually an interesting discussion internally, because so my colleague Adi and I, we've been feeding back the takeaways from this conference to our team, and our CEO actually disagreed with one of the takeaways from a previous conversation, which was that it has to be gender-based violence practitioners who communicate the data to finance people so that it is being understood properly. And our CEO said, no, she disagrees. She thinks it won't be until finance experts themselves talk about the GBV data so that they can convince other finance experts, because she says it really has to enter the language and has to be framed and phrased in the language that the finance people use every day. So in their analytics, in their methodologies and so on, for it to really be powerful. And I think that's exactly where we get back to the translators, because before finance people can talk about GBV, they have to understand what GBV is about, right? And for that, you still start with the translator and then a broker and a facilitator. But in the end, I guess there is some truth that finance experts themselves have to start using that data, other than the practitioners like on the other side trying to tell it to them.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
It touches on something I've just been thinking about just listening to people is I think it is clear that there are these different roles, and I think it's great we've brought up the broker, but coming back as well to the translator, but I liked your word interpreter too, Mary. I was really surprised actually when someone said during the conference, we have a lot more interest from the finance side in this, and then like GBV practitioners in finance, and I guess it's just like a mistrust or lack of interest on both sides. But I mean, there's so much work to do to even have this as even a possible conversation topic within any finance conversation. There is so much work to do there in interpreting, or just simply raising it, to be honest. And I mean, again, I feel like I've never worked with more women as I have worked when I've worked in gender equality more broadly. And it's wonderful, but I'm like, where are the men? Where are the men? And that's the organization I work with now. Some of these translators, interpreters need to also be men as well, all genders. How do we have, and this gets to my PowerPoint, and how do we get the power dynamic to shift, and also how do we use power to drive the message of this through the finance industry? And usually, therefore, we need to look at where in the finance industry they value people and where there is power that sits there. And if we can get the positions of power that are already valued within finance to believe this message and to become an interpreter, there is a strong, I mean, I'm speaking more from that finance angle. How do we drive that? And there's probably other ways on the other side too, but what is it that they value? Where do they see power? Where is power? How do we use that to drive change, and allow them to become the way in which that can also move through the industry? And I've forgotten the name. I was trying to look for it, but I was chatting to someone, and ESG investing really took off when prominent people that were valued in the finance industry got it, and then they started taking the message to the finance industry. It's the same sort of, like, I guess I work with a mode of change that brings male CEOs particularly together to drive change in gender equality. 10 years ago or so, I don't think it was commonplace in Australia to have domestic and family violence as a workplace issue. Obviously, there's been a lot of work from a lot of amazing organizations at all different levels. But one of the things that they did with our founding group of CEOs, this is like the biggest CEOs in Australia, the Army as well, and they brought some survivors in to have a very intimate conversation and sharing their stories. And obviously, a lot was sort of talked through at that point, and there was material I had to read beforehand. But coming out of that, I think just as human beings with positions of power that have some sense of wanting to drive some good, but also framing it as a workplace issue, and simply, they often use this language of, I will have victims in my organization, and I will also have perpetrators. And so like simply finding a couple of ways for them to tangibly connect, that then just drove a long-term change in terms of now it's becoming standard to have some of these things in organizations in Australia. And that is not just because of that one action, it's one of the actions along with just a huge amount of amazing work of so many organizations. But I think, how can we create interpreters out of people that already have power in these spheres? So yeah, connecting those things. And I think still holding both this interpreter as well as I think this important role of the broker that we've identified too.
Yeah, it's, you know, I really agree with a lot of points you raised, particularly around like kind of the human element to it and understanding who that world belief has power and influencing that. Because I think so, at least at Dahlberg, the way we've been thinking about the gender practice area is like, you kind of need to walk and chew gum, right? So like, what is kind of your immediate objective? Immediate objective, let's say, you know, I'm Christy's team member, I'm trying to raise resources in order to fund this direct service program in my domestic violence nonprofit. Like that's my immediate objective. And so for there, you kind of have to put on the hat of an advocate, right? You really need to influence people to go your way. And it's really like, it's about what moves you, what motivates you, what data do you, like kind of centering the person who you want to influence. And, you know, I think some of the points in the chat, right? Like so for example, what you said about, you know, how does GBV affect each member? Like, how is it real for me as a kind of owner of a company or investor in a company? Like, how does this manifest in my life? Like, that's very much centering, like it's centering the finance person who we're trying to give us money or give us investment or, you know, broker a relationship, whatever that is, right? So that's kind of the walking part. But the chewing gum part is just realizing that by doing that centering, by creating tailored data sets and, you know, identifying power structures there and bringing men along and doing all of that stuff, that is reinforcing the power dynamic that already we entered the situation to begin with. So we can't, it can't be our only strategy. Like it is a viable short-term strategy. And I think it has worked. I've seen lots of organizations where it's worked super effectively, right? To just really, what's effective advocacy look like in the space to like get you to do what I want, right? Like, how do I lobby you to get you to do what I want, right? And that is like totally valid short-term strategy, but like the longer-term strategy of like, how do you build power? How do you repair harm? How do you like upend these bigger structures? Like we just kind of can't lose sight of that. And the way around that, at least my perspective, is like representation. Like, you know, if we really believe that it's 1 in 4 people, right, in the world, or 1 in 4 women in their lifetime, that means they're survivors in all halls of power, right? Oh, but wait, it's not actually the case. You know what? Because that 1 in 4 isn't distributed equally. Right, the 4 aren't distributed equally among the halls of power, right? So there is something about just like elevating survivors, right? Like creating a financing movement that's like why? I mean, this is just me going like it's late in the day, but there's something about like why isn't the whole GBV sector funded by wealthy survivors? Like we could create a like, and I know there's some folks doing like Survivors Wealth Summit and things like that, and obviously we don't want to closeted and all of those caveats aside, but there is something about like there are rich survivors, and there are ways in which we can kind of build our own power as survivors to address some of this, as opposed to trying to like go outside to like other people who we need to then, you know, convince them to fund us, basically.
Thank you. I love all that, and the survivor lens piece was something I think I posted as well for this conference, for this session, around sort of that lens in the translator piece. And I wasn't in that earlier conversation, but how do we ensure that the survivor lens is part of this translator overall? The other piece that I'm hearing that I'm just sort of is a new idea for me, and this is something I've been thinking about a lot, so I'm excited about this, is potentially to address that, you know, we have sort of gender and GBV here and finance here, and we all sort of acknowledge this power dynamic. But the idea, Christy, that you raised about women's health organizations, and also Mary thinking about faith-based organizations, makes me wonder if potentially we are neglecting the allies who are around this space and the role that they can play in translation or interpretation or brokering, language maybe TBD, but the role that they might play as a neutral ground to take away some of those power dynamics. And for example, I lead our power policy program at Criterion, so we mostly work with governments, right? So I put governments maybe as another potential ally, right? And governments have their own power dynamics with finance, but it is a little bit different. So just throwing that into the mix as well. Jennifer, we haven't heard from you. Oh, now you're coughing. We haven't heard from you in a minute. I'll let you breathe.
Sorry, I'm just recovering from a cold. So actually the remote version of this is appropriate for me this week. I don't know that I have anything new to add. I've been following the comments in the chat box, and I think there's just lots of really interesting discussions going on. I really appreciated the kind of moral lens to this, and I think although that's not going to work all the time, I think it's an interesting alternative to the kind of business case financial piece that I think we often are encouraged to bring to a social change discussion. And sometimes it works, but I'm always a little uncomfortable with the business case, because, well, does that mean if it doesn't cost money, it's not a problem? And I mean, we I think we all are familiar with the kind of issues with that sort of thing. So it's not that that's bad, it's just that that's really not the only piece that we want to have. And so, yeah, I like the nuance of the moral. Everybody has a right to a degree of security and respect in their lives, and frankly, that should be enough. It's not, but it's a good place to start the discussion, I think. Anyway, I'm not saying anything new, but I appreciate all these different viewpoints.
And actually,
Adriana,
when we think about, oh, sorry, Regina.
Sorry.
Please go ahead.
Thanks. So, Adriana, to your point of finding intermediaries or allies, I think another group that I would count there, at least from a blended finance perspective, is the development agencies that already have mainstream gender into their operations. Because what happens is when, let's say, the Australian government is trying to negotiate with a private bank about, under what terms and conditions they will participate in that fund structure or in that facility, the Australian government will be the one that says, well, but we also want to look at the gender angle of this transaction. And what do you have to say here? And so the bank sitting at the table with that government will then hear from somebody who also has money and bringing money to the table that gender is important, right? And then that starts the process of discussing gender aspects in that whole transaction. So I find that notion of allies really important. And if these allies help to shift the power or make gender aspects more heard in the discussion, then I think they can be really crucial in also shifting the perception of what is important.
Yeah, just to add something, just remembered something now. Do we have anyone from the World Bank in Convergence? Do you know? Because I remember I was in a conference last year and they presented, they created a gender toolkit, kind of to mainstream gender lens to all the projects from the World Bank. So being infrastructure, like any area of work. So maybe I could try to see if I have it and share. I thought it was really interesting because it was really looking at gender in all the different projects for the World Bank.
Yeah, so World Bank could also fit in that category. IFC, any of the multilateral development banks, so Asian Development Bank, African Development Bank, a lot of them have started to mainstream gender, and they can be those allies. So I think that's a very valid point, Laura.
Yeah.
I'm going to suggest a couple interpretive tools that I found really helpful that might be helpful. One you've already been speaking to, which is a way to talk about analysis, and then the other is talking in analogies. And I'll just give my example of how this came to be. So I work in a Protestant denomination in the US, and starting in 2012, we started to work on social teaching from our faith tradition on sexism. And we had a task force of 20 some people from across our whole church, and they were really not understanding what I was trying to help them see, which is sexism is not about being nice to women. It's actually a systemic problem. And the way I was able to help them make the leap over the puddle was with a rubric of an upside down triangle. And on the top of this inverted triangle, I listed like social problems. And so gender-based violence could be at the top of that inverted triangle. And then each of those legs, one is things that have to do with policies, laws, practices, things that government or businesses are responsible for. And then this other leg are our social ideologies, our cultural ideals, our religious beliefs. And I use that to help them see how they all reinforce the problem or interrupt the problem. And I wonder if having kind of these simple tools not only helps people see how there's a systemic problem with gender-based violence, but to see for business people, for finance people to see their place in that whole constellation. And it might do something about the gender or the power imbalance as well. How do they see their one part in it? And then others in the whole, you know, because it can be a negative analysis, it can also be the positive analysis. How is it that you're changing the word at the top of this inverted triangle, and who's got different roles? And we've talked many times this month about the many entry points. Someone on the call here has referred to that. And the other is speaking in analogies. And the one analogy that came to me as I listened to all of you is thinking about child abuse in the classroom and the role of the teacher and the role of the social workers in a school and the role of the other students, et cetera, in the instance of a child being harmed, whether it's in school or by the family, and the responsibilities that all those actors and institutions play in making a change with that. Is there a way that that kind of analogy could hold true for companies? Is there a way for the CEO to see themselves as responsible in this system, again, because there's actual illegal harm being done to someone in their, I don't know what noun I want, scope, daily life, responsibility, or whatever. So just, I wonder if those are interpretive tools.
Mary, I really like that. Thank you for sharing. And I'd love if you would be willing to share an example of this inverted triangle tool on our workspace, please. It sounds really useful.
Yeah, they all joked after like about an hour, oh, it's the Stroyford triangle, you know, so sure.
Please do. And, you know, and I think your analogy about children in the child abuse in the classroom, it sort of does bring up this last piece I was hoping we would get to, which is about who is responsible and where does that responsibility lie and how do we sort of leverage responsibility. I think it's a potentially valuable way of looking at responsibility in terms of social change.
And Judith, I really like your idea of bringing it all together and talking about all the stories that are at play at one particular place. I think that is a great way of also illustrating some of the issues and like also showing where the different touch points are, and that everybody, no matter what age you are or what you're doing every day of your life, has touch points, right? So I think that's a great idea.
We've bought into the importance of having the conversation about the environment. Mm-hmm. And yet when it comes to the environment we live in as humans, the human environment, the culture, we get all weird about that, you know. So here we're saying is we want our environment to be free of pollution. I want my social environment to be free of GBV pollution. Mm-hmm. It's not a different argument. It's the same argument. Just as I don't want to breathe bad air, I don't want to, be affected by inappropriate words, or inappropriate behaviors. It affects my quality of living. So if we're not changing the cultures within which we live that are polluted, then we're living in pollution. So we can, just because it's human, it gets it gets weird. Well, who am I to tell you what to do and how to behave, and why should I be controlling those? Yes, we absolutely should be controlling this. We should not allow people to pollute our work environments with toxic behavior. We shouldn't allow people to pollute our college campuses with toxic behavior. And how do we make that argument fundable? That's where it gets complicated.
And I'd love to go there. I mean, who pays for it, right? I mean, what's the business model? Clearly there's a need for this translation and sort of, and I like your metaphor there of pollution in our environment, right? That's really powerful.
I'm going to share a tiny little frustration. My father is a professor of business ethics at NYU Stern, okay? And he was at the Wharton School of Business for 15 years. I cannot get him to understand this conversation.
And that's the crux of it, right? Is how do we get the Whartons and the
business ethics? Yeah. So it's a tough sell. I had a conversation with Teen this afternoon, and I said to her, funny, we were supposed to do a International Women's Day program for a major finance company in Israel. So, the equivalent, the Israeli equivalent of Merrill Lynch. And when we sent them the price, which is probably about, a couple, maybe $2,000 max, the response was, "Oh, that's not in our budget." But, talking to them about, meditating and taking care of yourself, that they'll be able to find somebody who'll do it for them for $400. No, it's got to change all over. Like, we can prevent a lot of this, not all of this. There will always be jerks in the world, just as there will always be people who want to steal my car. But we can do things to change the statistics, to reduce the levels of completion. We just need to be investing in it. And I will get off my soapbox now. Sorry.
Yeah, no need to apologize. I've seen the same darling reaction to climate change in a lot of my work globally with I'm connected to an organization of like about 80 million people from my faith globally, and things that have to do with women, it's hard work and a hard sell, and stuff with climate, it's a darling. It doesn't answer what's the business model though.
Any crazy creative ideas?
Oh gosh, it's just like there's so much in this. We could get into big conversations about how our economies are structured and our incentives and the governing laws over finance. Anyway, there's a lot there. But who's responsible? I just wanted to echo, I think I don't know, I'm not going to try and answer that. I think framing conversations, as you've all said, around how each industry plays a part in this, I think is a really important part of that. So I really liked your point, Mary, about that. I just keep coming back to, and I guess that's why I do the work that I do, where is their power? How do I get that powerful person on board? And typically, and again, I'm just going to speak from what I do, but that happens in a power collective where it's a mutually reinforcing, powerful peer group that it's almost like embarrassing if one person doesn't also step up. So there's something around placing responsibility where power is, and then working out how to not make it an individual attack on that person of power, but create an environment that says you all need, like, you have the power, and make it really positive to do X, Y, and Z, and to have that legacy as to who you are and what you're about and what this can do. And there's lots of ways to frame that. And then using that peer power pressure to try to start to use that as a way to place responsibility on them. I'm going to stop there. I'm loving everyone's conversations.
I know. I'm also looking at the clock and realizing this time went by really fast. So maybe just sort of, I guess we won't solve it all today, but I think we went to some really interesting places and sort of slowly pushing the needle. But maybe some final reflections about what you're taking from this conversation, anything that you learned or that impacted you, and what came up today in this translator piece.
I'll reinforce what, you say Rosanna or Roseanne?
You said it perfectly, Rosanna. Perfect.
Okay, what Rosanna was saying is how, because that's one of the things I've done with like the bishops in my denomination, is I ask them to amplify even the very small thing they're already doing in their jurisdiction, and to be on stage to do it. How do I help provide? So maybe part of the business model is providing the stage for the people. And Joy said this a few days ago. Don't shut down those who are doing even the tiny thing. Just don't let that be the last thing they're doing. And so how is it that you help to amplify the tiny thing so that there's the encouragement or the push or the embarrassment not to do more? So that's the only piece I've got right now for business model.
I think one thing I'm thinking is, like, when we're comparing with climate change and how, I think two things came up for me. One is, like, people started to make money, so then that's why they started to really be concerned about it, but also because it's like a universal problem. And I think going back to what Judith said before, like how we can frame it's not only a women's problem, and not talking only about LGBTQ and other gender identities, but also, and then putting another concept here is toxic masculinity, which is intrinsically linked to gender-based violence, and how toxic masculinity is bad for men, right? So they are also being affected negatively by the system that enables gender-based violence. So, and maybe we need to start with the semi-converted, like maybe they're not completely bought into, but they are more sensitive to it, going back to GBV sensitive that you did put on the chart. So I think we can't continue to preach only to the converted, but maybe there are people already sensitive to that can understand what's the issue for them and who have the power. So maybe be like the, I don't know, the low-hanging fruits, as people like to say as well. So we need to find who those people are to start the work with them. And maybe they are the ones who are doing tiny things and keep encouraging them and even praising them for what they're doing, even if we think they are doing nothing exceptional, but if they feel they are doing something exceptional, they might want to do more and inspire others to follow them.
My takeaway relates to what Laura just said, because I actually think the fact that gender-based violence is a global issue can be to its advantage. So just like, you know, people listen more when you say, well, it's everywhere, like it's all around you, you can't escape it. I don't think right now that narrative is being used to really draw attention. I think some people try, but like it's not yet that everybody knows, right? You have to repeat the message, like you have to continue to do that, to use that symbol of a pandemic, right? Like Criterion Institute has been doing for the last couple of years as a global pandemic. So I actually think there's a lot of persuasion in that image, and there can then also as a result be a lot of allies between different organizations that have different goals, right? But still somehow relate to it, whether it's gender-based violence in the workplace, whether it's, you know, children-related issues, or whether it's religion-related issues, or from the finance side, right? So they all come together because it is a global issue. So that's something that I like, an idea that I would like to explore a little further, and that I would also think about a little more, because I think that can help with the translation and the awareness that we need to create.
Thank you.
Lots of food for thought. I have been loving this process. It's energizing, and yeah, and so thank you all.
Thank you. Jennifer, Christy, final thoughts, reflections?
I need to think on it some more, I think. In my mind, I keep saying maybe a shaming campaign is necessary, because I think that would happen with climate change a little bit. Like, look at this industry, the airline industry, they are ruining the planet. Okay, now there we have, like, you know, climate credits and stuff coming out of there. Like, but I don't know if that has a long-term impact. We're still waiting. I think that's what happened with the Me Too movement, and it worked, but we think we need to see who's elected in November to see if it really worked. You know what I mean? We need to see, does shaming work? If it does, let's just do that right now. I'm over it. I'm over it. I'm over it making the business case. That's how I feel.
It'd be nice to think that a combination of shaming and amplifying would work, so that, you know, people that might be able to be moved in one direction, you know, you can, I guess you can try the carrot and the, you know, the praise, and frankly, there's a lot of shame to go around. So, you know, that's worked in other cases too. So yeah, it's probably a bit of both, but it'd be nice to think that the positive side would work more.
Laura?
Yeah, I think,
Go ahead.
No, I was just reflecting on where we started with the conversation about, like, when we're talking between individuals and individuals, and like just recognizing that it is hard work, and that actually maybe, like, you know, I think actually just holding the space that I sometimes feel like I'm willing to sit down and have an ongoing conversation with a man about gender equality on some things, because maybe I've been at least personally affected by some of this, and I'm not working day to day with women affected in really horrific situations, and maybe I can play that role because I can hold that space with someone that's being really infuriating. But seeing them as an individual and a person, and the ability that if I can sit with this, and if they're able to have a new thought or a new way of thinking about this, that's a shift that I can create in the world. And I'm willing to put myself there, and I'm not asking everyone else to do that. So I think, I don't know, just coming back to the individual usually it doesn't work to shame someone. It is also something that we can hold people account, and we can also not have to indulge bad behavior or unhelpful, uneducated thinking too. So I think an interpreter can be someone that can, or a translator. If we're going back to the one-on-one, how do we hold the space for humanity and growth, but also know where we pick our battles and where we spend our time, and also allowing the space, given this is everything we do is human, but interpreters that might be able to hold the weight of some of that really hard, exhausting, frustrating conversations that have to happen, and just knowing that it's okay that people play different roles and not everyone has to do that. Not everyone has to pick that up because they're already doing just too much other stuff around the actual direct work in this space.
Right, and the translation itself is its own role and not the overburden. Yeah, that's a really good point. Thank you. Laura? Either Laura, I guess.
I'm in a similar place to Christy in that I'm processing and thinking about how this applies to our work and how we sort of harness some of these ideas and move them forward. And I think there's a lot in that's still percolating in my brain. So we've covered a lot of ground, I feel, and I've been taking notes, which, you know, will somehow make sense beyond this conversation. But I just want to encourage everyone to stay connected and to keep talking about this and to share resources and to reach out. And I said this on our regional connect, but I feel like I want to say it again because this is the last conversation I'm in. But if you haven't met someone yet in Convergence, don't let that be a barrier to connecting with them, because everyone who's here is just as up for this collaboration as you have met or everyone who's expressed it on this call. So I feel like I can't see the way forward, but I know it has to do with us all working together. So I want to encourage that spirit as we close out.
Thank you. And here we are. So what a privilege. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you all for being here. And it is to be continued. So I have no idea how we'll summarize this call for the deck that Joy will do tomorrow, but we covered a lot, and I hope let's keep the threads going. So thank you all. Have a good rest of your days, whatever time zone you're in.